So welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I'm also a fiction writer. I've published a story collection and a novel. So that's why I get to have this conversation today, because I am technically an expert. I don't know. We'll pretend. I'm going to pretend expertise, even if I lack it. So it's my pleasure today to welcome Megan Kamalei Kakimoto to discuss Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare, a wonderful debut story collection from a wonderful debut author. And Megan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to see you virtually and so great to be in community with you all.
Yeah, and Megan, we met at virtual Bread Loaf over pandemic. And
We did.
yeah, with a work we took a workshop with led by Laura Vandenberg.
Yeah.
And that was also Marissa Cranes was in that one. So this has been a good year for that workshop. This year's been like lots of big, awesome books being published. Justin, there were only 6 of us in there. So
I know. I loved that workshop so much too. I felt like everyone was writing such different things and we all were so passionate about it and about being in community with each other's work. So that was amazing.
And this is fun too, because I mean, I think we both sort of reached out to each other and said, hey, we like each other's work. It has, the touch of the weird, the touch of the impossible or the surreal or the magical or whatever term you want to use. So it's nice to see not long after that this book came out and that this was the beginning of something that it's always nice to have been there at the beginning. So I feel like I was there at the beginning of something really big and awesome with your writing. So I'm really glad that you're here with us.
Thank you.
Do you have your book handy?
I do, yes.
Would you read us just an excerpt? Doesn't have to be too long, but just something to give a taste of your writing and what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the evening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been reading actually a lot from like the first 2 stories. So I'm actually going to switch it up a little and read the opening of the last story. The story is titled The Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower. I sneeze into the corpse flower and a geyser of spittle settles over the leaves. Who buys a corpse flower for a dead woman's wake? In the wake of your wife's death, here is a plant of intolerable fragrance. No friend of mine, I decide, sharing a pinch of the sealed maroon spathe between my fingers, surrendering it to my dead wife's listing floors. With no one left occupying the house, I pluck the enormous potted plant from the lip of the marble counter to send it elsewhere. The bathroom, perhaps, or maybe the yard. Weeds sprouting like pinpricks kneading through the parched grass. How Nunny was meticulous in the keeping of that yard, so it's nice to see the plot go to shit now. Like finally we have carved out some breathing room. The pot sinks like a weighted blanket in my hands, its awful column stretching nearly 3 feet tall, and it's true I don't want this stupid plant anywhere near this house, but what about ghosts? What of returning spirits and lingering losses, of adhering to your wife's last wishes that her home be infested by the raging flora of her friends? I drop the plant on the couch, give it Haunani's favorite reclining spot on the narrow Shea lounge. Can't risk more curses, not in this home. Already I'm sneezing, drooling like a dog who's fractured a tooth, so you better believe I'm not messing around. Just think the plant looks perfectly fine on the Shea lounge. Sits up alert like Haunani in her living years. I'm almost tempted to drape it with a sheet. The rest of the house is budding chaos and can rightly stay that way. Folks are gone, days pow. I'm a widow in no rush. I check that the curtains are drawn, and then I'm loosening my slate black wrap dress, letting it fall to the floor like sloughed skin. Underneath, I'm wearing bulky cotton underwear, no bra. My thick neck choked by a string of Tahitian pearls. My hair tumbles in gray ribbons. An old fat widow, finally. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So in your own words, who the heck are you?
So I am Megan Kamalei Kakimoto. I am a writer, but I'm also a reader. And I think beyond that, I like to think about myself in the terms of sort of the communities that I inhabit. So I feel like I am a daughter, I'm a sister, as well as a partner, and I am a pet mom as well.
What pets? That's important.
I have a cat and a dog, and I actually should have begun with the warning too, that the dog tends to be very stereotypical dog when the mailman comes. So in the event that you do hear a little bit of a chaotic dog sound, that would be that.
Noted. I mean, there's always a chance that one of the three cats will try to hop on
Yes.
it. Well, two of the three cats, the third one will never do that. So two of them may just make an appearance before the event is over. So the first question we like to ask is also sometimes the hardest. I hope it is not too hard for you, but it's what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before?
It's such a good question. It is a very challenging question, I think. And I was thinking about this a lot in the aftermath of an event that I did on Saturday with a writer who I'll talk about her later probably, but just has been so influential for me. And her name is Christiana Kahakawila. And she is one of the only Indigenous Hawaiian short story writers that I've had the pleasure of sort of reading and immersing myself in her work. And I'd been thinking a lot around this idea of family and how sort of family as readers of your own work. And it was something that I hadn't been asked about. I was recently asked about, but it's been something that I was just sort of thinking around. And I was actually really grateful for the opportunity to make this space around it, about this question of like, so what is the experience of being read by your family? And I think that it feels really connected and personal to me because of, especially growing up in Hawaii, family is such an integral part of your being, and sort of well beyond just childhood and youth. A lot of my most important relationships are still with, my immediate family, parents, but also grandparents, kapuna. And I think that, the stories in this collection, I didn't feel like I was holding back in a way. And I think I was very scared. I don't think I spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I do think that I was very scared to sort of open up that reading audience to include family, because I am so incredibly different from my family, but their opinions also mean a lot to me. And I think that having the space to share not only how important they are to me, but also that fear around being read by people who know you so intimately and so deeply, was a good, I think, I just really appreciated that space to consider it and to acknowledge that there's a lot of anxiety around that, but also a lot of kind of pleasure and a privilege to be able to be read by your ohana.
I've always had to, just in my head, imagine that no one like that is ever going to read my work on them.
Ever.
Yeah, never. They don't exist. They're all illiterate. They can't possibly read this.
Yeah.
It's all gonna be fine. So a topic that a sort of new topic for me, but something that I've identified lately in writing that I see in your writing is a sense of wonder. And by wonder, I mean writing that allows itself to wonder instead of like trying to state things outright, trying to declare, trying to have a point, so to speak. And I don't mean that your work doesn't have a point, but that intent isn't so hit you over the head with the intent. So how do you let yourself be open to a big idea or a weird idea or the dangerous kind of emotion? But I think you were hitting at that a little bit in your previous comment, like especially the dangerous emotion idea. How do you let yourself be open to that? How do you keep that wonder alive and flowing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you also kind of hinted to one of the aspects of that in terms of just completely draining my brain of any sense of reader or audience. So much of staying in that draft without just any sense of pressure of this ever being looked at by anyone but myself, I think is just an incredibly important part of my writing process. And I also think just so much of what drives a story for me is the wonder. And I think when I am setting out to write a story, it may not be like starting with this big looming question, but I often feel like I'm driven by a sense of wanting to experience, like be in an experience or immerse myself in an experience that I have never had, will probably never had, could never have. And also just be open to what that looks like. I really love fiction that sort of embodies both the physical bodies and also the minds of a variety of different characters and people. And I think that that embodiment demands a lot of space for wondering and not trying to sort of nail down, like you said, a statement or an experience in such a clear-cut manner. So I do feel like just that sense of immediate wonder is so necessary, at least for me when I'm starting out a draft or a story. And I try to follow it as for as long as I can. Yeah.
So I think that leads great to my next question, which is, so the stories feel very refined, though, despite having this sense of wonder. And how do you revise, but not revise out whatever that something is that gives the drafts that quality of wonder? How do you approach revision with that in mind, with the idea of maintaining the thing you capture in an earlier draft, as you're worried about things on a sentence level or worried about the shape of a plot and things like that?
Yeah. Revision is a really very important part of my process. And a lot of revision for me is actually rewriting. I kind of identified early on that my writing style is sort of these, not very fast, but sort of relatively quick, fairly messy first drafts. And when I return to a story to work on it for revision, I end up, not to be too nuts and boltsy, but I do sort of go into that work by retyping. And a lot of that experience for me is I try to keep the original draft as much as possible. I try to keep it far away. Sometimes I'll keep it a little closer. But I tend to retype stories for several drafts. And in that process, a lot of the language that I, felt so attached to in that first draft sometimes falls away, or not even just the language, but sometimes even characters, sometimes different character arcs, different little idiosyncrasies. Sometimes that'll fall away in that first draft, and I am able to sort of create something new in the second draft and then in the third draft. And through this process, it's sort of been like, it takes a lot long. I guess it takes a lot longer because I feel like I'm revising several times. But I feel like that was a practice that I had started, especially in graduate school, as a way to not lose the wonder and to not lose sort of the constant desire to get closer and closer to a character or to the character's experience. And I also feel like that rewriting process for me helps me to sort of let go. I've noticed that I need a lot of time with a character where when I go into a story, my first gut thing is to cling really close and to kind of just this clenched fist approach of trying to control every part of a narrative. And the whole rewriting process is a process of like, okay, I am going to try my best to let go and follow the character instead of trying to direct the character as much as possible. Because that's where a lot of the surprise happens. And the surprise is, it doesn't happen in every story, at least for me when I'm writing, but it's also some of the most like delightful parts of writing.
So, I mean, I realized that my question was perhaps a little bit leading, because I said about how do you preserve wonder that happens in first drafts, but do you also discover new points of wonder during revision? Because you said you have an intensive revision process. How does wonder arise as you go through? Are you discovering things constantly as you go back through and recognizing new connections or new possibilities?
Yeah, I think I'm constantly discovering along the way too. And I think that with that is one of just the joys of the rewriting process for me, is that it just makes space. It makes space for new things to pop up, new threads that I may not have even picked up on in the first draft, and gives me the time to consider them in just a different form. When I'm writing that first draft, a lot of it is trying to discover what I'm interested in, what this story is interested in. And with revision, I just feel like I'm able to sort of pay a closer attention to the little things as well as the big things.
Great. Just a reminder, if you have any questions from the audience, please put them in the chat window and we'll get to as many of those as possible, if not all of them. So the next thing I want to talk about was characterization. I feel like I don't talk about characterization enough, and I think it's a good time to do it because I think there's really great characterization throughout all the stories in the collection. It's, as I think the phrase I wrote was populating your pages with people, and there's a nice little, I'm gonna keep that alliteration going there.
I love it.
So I want to talk to you about how you approach characterization. For example, in the story Temporary Dwellers, I think that's just a great character study in general between the narrator and the girl. There's the unnamed girl, and we get a great paragraph just on the second page, which is one of those double duty paragraphs of characterizing the girl who's being described, but also revealing a lot about the narrator in the way the description is, what's being chosen to be described and the way to describe it. And one line in particular was, she says "fuck" a lot and leaves half-eaten bowls of cereal curdling in the sink, which, just I love a sentence which just does a lot of characterizational lifting in an economy of words. So I think that's just very encapsulating. And that whole paragraph, like every sentence is working on that level. That whole paragraph is great, because every sentence is some little nugget like that, which like carries so much weight about who the person is and who the person perceiving the person is. So what are the techniques of characterization you're kind of conscious of as you read and revise? What are the deliberate things you're maybe kind of trying to do when you have an idea for a character? How do you take that idea and turn it into a knowable, relatable character?
Yeah, I love that. I think that so much. So I guess when I'm working with character, I feel equally invested in both trying to experience like the character's physicality as well as what it feels like to be in their minds. A lot of these stories began with an interest in these characters and sort of the experience of, writing into an experience that either caused me alarm or caused me sort of excitement. And a lot of that excitement and fear always resides in sort of the experience of the character that I'm writing into. I think that with short stories, like you said, I feel like I'm very attentive to being economical and trying to pay attention, hone in on the very specific, very kind of small details that are able to do, like you said, sort of the big work. Because I'm simply, working in a smaller space, a smaller canvas. So I feel like as a writer, I've learned so much from reading other people's work, reading really incredible writers and how they approach writing into character. And I don't know if this is a very great answer, but I do think that, once you read enough, you kind of have almost like an intuitive sense of what kind of details are able to illuminate a larger life. So for me, I gravitate a lot towards staying in a character's mind and in their thoughts. I am not so, it doesn't come as natural to me to sort of write a person's exterior and sort of how they embody the world physically, even though that's the thing that is one of the most interesting things to me. So it's a long-winded way of saying that I think for that, I kind of push myself to focus on both elements of kind of attending to the interior as well as attending to the physical. And yeah, letting that character really drive what choices I'm making. Because at the end of the day, I tend to isolate these small details, but over that revision process and over the time that I spend on these drafts, certain things will come up enough that I know that they have the heat and that are important to pay attention to, and other things I'll notice other details will sort of fall away. And that's kind of my process of how I keep what ends up in that that final draft.
Do you do like extensive character pre-planning, or is this like, do you, I mean, character Bible level? I mean, are you?
Yeah, I used to. When I was just trying to figure out what kind of writer I wanted to be, I used to do like character bio sheets and sort of ran the gamut of different ways that I would approach a story. But for these stories, I felt like I started with, more often than not, with a character's voice, both their sort of sonic voice and also the voice inside their head, and really just wrote those messy first drafts, and that's sort of where the characters would initially appear to me. I did very little pre character planning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a couple questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to hop over there. The first one is, when you say that you put drafts aside while you revise, what does that mean for you exactly? Do you reread drafts before putting them aside? Do you take anything forward from earlier drafts verbatim? How does that drafting process work for you?
I love that. I think so. I admittedly, when I say I put drafts aside, I'm always kind of working in the revision process. I'm always working on those printed copies of my story. I like to imagine that I can just like put a draft aside into a drawer and then just never look at it again and then write it completely fresh. But I don't do that often. I think that I like to have a draft near, so I literally will have it in a folder to the left of my computer while I'm working. And I'll be honest, I look at it all of the time, and I try to make myself not. And I'll try little tricks to make myself not, like I'll put it in the little drawer, but more often than not, it comes out. And I think that I like to read my drafts aloud. So before I start on the next draft, I will have sort of read aloud to myself the draft that came before. And things stand out to me that way. Lines will stand out to me. I'll underline things, I'll highlight things that I just am scared of losing, even though it's right there. Sometimes, even though I underline it and I feel like this is the perfect sentence, like it's going to stay for sure, like several drafts later, it doesn't. And I've come to a point where I'm totally fine with that. But for me, so to answer that question, I do often take some lines verbatim, and throughout that process, they'll either stay, they might come earlier in the draft, they might come later in the draft. But it's sort of a mix where, depending on what the story needs, and most of these stories in the collection at least needed a lot of time and several drafts, I'll just keep it very close where I can refer to it. But there's something about the retyping process too that I didn't really think about before. I started thinking about it essentially in like 2020, when I was revisiting these stories, sort of a few of these stories, and thinking about the book as, oh, it could be a collection. And that was sort of when I just started working in that method of I'm just going to start retyping a story. And even if I find myself, I'm literally just retyping everything that has come before in my little document to my left. There's something that my brain does anyway in that process that invites imagination in and invites the ability to re-see the draft, that I've found very valuable, at least for myself, for my own process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question from the chat. For you, do the characters tend to manifest to you first, or themes or plots or other elements? How do you move between those elements throughout your process?
Yeah. Most often for me, it's character. I also have said before that tone plays a really important part in my writing process. And I don't know if I'm so married to that idea, and I think it's still true. But there was some sense that, like, for a lot of these stories, for sort of the titular story, for example, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare, I really needed to capture this sort of this eerie tone that also felt very I don't know, accessible, and I needed to get that tone right before I could write into the character. That said, a lot of the other stories were very much character driven. And I think that sort of plot and theme and it's important to me. But I do think that they sort of show up later. Theme especially, although I think that I do have, I have my own obsessions. I have these ideas in my head that are very sticky, that are going to show up in these stories many times. So I think it's always at the back of my head. But what I've tried so hard to do with these stories was that letting go process of learning that it's important to not feel so, for me, to feel so wedded to a story trajectory or a story plot or a story arc, to really let my characters kind of move through space and move through these situations and kind of make really crappy decisions sometimes, and bear witness to how that plays out, because I think that's where the plot really came through for me when I was writing.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat window. One thing I would theorize is, I do feel like some of these stories also come from the place where, characters meet place or setting.
Mm-hmm.
Like that interaction spawns a lot of this. So I want to talk about place a little bit and setting a little bit, because I think these stories honor place and explore place and expose place in really interesting ways. And often all three of those things at once. So how do you approach rendering place on the page? What are the things you're looking for to make something real in the reader's mind?
Yeah, I love talking about place. I think that, all these stories are united by taking actual place in Hawaii, across the Hawaiian Islands, most of them on Oahu, but a couple one on Molokai and one centering the island of Kauai. And, I think place for me is one of the most natural things for me to write, I'd say. I have an interesting relationship to place in relation to these stories, because they were sort of written across my relationship to Honolulu and to Hawaii. Some of them I had started and finished here while I was living here in Hawaii. Others I started and finished when I was living in Austin. And I am kind of only reflecting now on what that experience looked like, how different, where I was in space kind of affected the way certain stories were written. But I think with writing place, I am the way that I approach it anyway is just to approach it in a way that feels true to me and to my experience. So sometimes going back to sort of, pulling out little details, I really like writing sort of about monkey pod trees and sort of the way that they're so common and everywhere in my neighborhood anyway. The call of pigeons and the call of myna birds. There's different things about place, different details that I like to write around place, that just are really central to my own life and my upbringing here. And I feel like I just try to render the Hawaii that I grew up living in. I think I've noticed sort of a fear or an anxiety that can bubble up for me of having to capture a certain type of Hawaii or a certain common communal experience of living here. And I think I just really had to banish that, because that doesn't exist. And I really ended up just trying to focus on the little things that make living here in Hawaii so unique and so distinctive for me personally.
So I related to that, and I know when I'm writing about, I'm from Savannah, Georgia, whenever that shows up, I feel like there's this balance, which is you do want to introduce the place for people who don't know it, but you're also not trying to write a travel guide, which I've also done for Savannah. So, I mean, I guess I've done that separately, but how do you sort of balance that? How do you walk that fine line between immersive and info dump in terms
Yeah,
of sharing a place?
it's really tricky, right? Um, I I I would hope I had a good answer for that. I think that a lot of it, a lot of that work for me comes in revision, because when I'm writing that first draft, I really just don't want to be hampered by any expectations of readers or audience or any of that. I want to get the draft out that renders place most authentically to my experience. And then, when I'm revisiting a work, I think what helps me is I'm a writer who likes to share my work with other writers, and I like to receive other people's work. And I find that I am constantly learning and growing as a writer by doing so. So some of the best things that has happened for me is, being in workshop with like you, and being in workshop with my fellows at my MFA program, and getting feedback. Not, I think there's a lot of to be said about how to approach a workshop, and how to wade through the feedback dump. But I think that there's a sense of over time that I've been able to cultivate of what sort of feedback resonates with me. And when I'm sort of approaching a draft and how place comes in, I think that those readers for me are really important, because I I don't want to feel like I have to have an expectation on me to explain my home and my homeland to anyone. But at the same time, I want readers to feel welcomed in. That's really important to me. And I think that getting those early reads on my work has always been very beneficial for me. And it's been able to, you know, point out to me at least where things are resonating with readers, and where the story might need just a bit more to really open up that door a little more.
Great, thank you. Um, is there anything, so someone just to follow up on that, like writing about a locale without writing a travel guide, that's something I have to watch out for in my own work. Do you have any piece of advice for how to strike that balance? Like any just sort of practical, like any things that you caught yourself doing, or that maybe you noticed in revision that you, things you added or subtracted to find the right balance?
Yeah, so something I noticed. So I'm an overwriter by nature. Something that I would notice about myself where I was, or my writing, where, for example, if I was writing about a place where I go to often, is sort of Manoa Valley Park, to walk my dog. And I had actually very recently, I've been working on a story that a part of it takes place in the park. And I picked up on myself, I would mention the park, and then I would spend like several pages sort of describing the park, and then describing where it was situated within the valley of Manoa, and then where Manoa was situated within the island of Oahu. And it sort of just became this sprawling thing. And I know that that's something that I did as well in some of these earlier stories. And sometimes for me, it's a matter of paring back. That's just my own style. Is I know that I have to sort of write into the weeds, very, do that overwriting work. And that I have to be conscious of the paring back. And sometimes all readers need to know is that it's at Manoa Park. And that was sort of a helpful thing for me. And yeah, I guess other things was something that I wanted to be okay with naming indigenous plants, or naming specific flowers with Hawaiian names, and not having to do the extra labor to situate those flowers, those plants, those communities within the larger context of that sort of Western readers might understand. I was okay with not having to do that. And I think that for me was the more authentic way of telling these stories, at least for me.
Great. I think too, there's always like that consideration of a first person narrator, what in the context of the first person narration would a narrator share?
Yep, definitely.
and sometimes that tells you how much to do, just because there's a time where it's very clearly the narrator speaking, and if it goes too far, it's very clearly that the author
This
is
is the
sharing
author.
information through the narrator. So if you can find that
Absolutely.
point in your first person narration, or third person close, even if what would this perspective be noticing? Are they going to give you a history lesson of a place? Probably not. They're just going to notice the things that stand out to them as someone who's familiar with a place, and it's very different than what a tourist would be paying attention to in a place. So
Yeah, that's such a good note. Yeah.
So these are also often fantasticalized versions of place, and that's a slightly different category to me, and one I just want to have a couple questions before going back to the chat for some more. So what draws you to the mythic and magical possibilities of a setting? Because I think it's not just that there's a setting, it's the magic and myth is in the setting, and you've chosen to, again, that's a part of the setting you've chosen to focus on instead of like something necessarily alien to it.
Yeah. No, yeah. The mythic and sort of these cultural legends and the mythology is just absolutely integral to these stories. And I sort of knew that from writing into these stories. I've always been drawn to sort of ancestral stories, and the stories in particular that were passed down to me by my kupuna, and especially my grams, who's my mom's mom, who passed away 10 plus years ago. But she's my Hawaiian grandma, and so many of these stories are Hawaiian mythology. If it's not central to the story, then it's just kind of bubbling under the surface of every story. And I kind of noticed that very early on, writing stories that weren't linked by anything other than, oh, they're taking place in the same a collection of islands. And when I did a little more work on them, and I noticed how important mythology was, not only to the stories but also to like the characters that were embodying these stories and living in these stories, I just kind of followed that impulse and followed that heat. So I love really works as a reader. I love works that introduce mythology and folklore, especially indigenous mythology, while also making space for contemporary concerns and contemporary interests and obsessions. And for me, that's what this collection is sort of my way of trying to find a path toward honoring these very important Hawaiian mythologies, and mo'olelo is what we call it in Olelo, Hawaii, while also making space for imagination and for my own interests. So, writing into sort of the female body and the female experience, recording local superstitions, writing into kind of grief and what that looks like, and also the grief of land loss, and not being able to make a life on your homeland. All these things sort of fed into the collection, with mythology kind of paving a path, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm also then interested in how the mythical plays more with the quotidian and how they interact, because and how does the mythical function as a lens to view the everyday, but then how does the contemporary everyday act as a lens to view the mythical? How are those playing against each other throughout? Because I think there's so much interesting happening there, where the mythical is right up beside the normal.
Yeah, I think I'll say that's sometimes what it feels like living here in Hawaii. It feels very much like negotiating with the normal, with the daily, the quotidian, but also I'm constantly being reminded and in conversation with relatives and friends about this, the night marchers and the story of the night marchers, the legends of the night marchers as the spirits of Hawaiian warriors, who are sort of protecting sacred lands now. And I think at least from where the communities that I've grown up in, we regard these sort of mythic stories and mythic tales as as very real and very relevant to our own lives. I also think that something I love so much about Hawaiian mythology is that it may feel very serious, like they demand to be taken seriously, but they also make space for humor and for play. Like there's a lot of lightheartedness in these stories, and it's not to say that that lightheartedness like undercuts the, you know, the reverence that we have for them, but you know, the gods and the goddesses that are kind of inhabiting the myths that I grew up in, they also like to cause trouble, and they like to sort of do a lot of work with shape-shifting and just kind of screwing around with humans, which I've always really enjoyed reading and sort of hearing those stories. So I think that just daily life feels that way sometimes. Not that I'm being messed around with by Pele, by the Hawaiian goddess on a daily basis, but I think just there's a sense of sort of a blurring of what might be considered reality and what might be considered unreality, that I feel like I have the privilege and the fear of living in every day.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Question in the chat window. I'd love to hear about your time in your MFA program and how it relates to this collection. How did the time at the Michener Center shape you as a writer and help shape this collection? And do you think writers should try to study in an MFA program if they can?
Yeah, that's a good question. So from my experience with my MFA, in relation to these stories, I had an incredible sort of cohort of students. I'm just going to go back real quick and say that with these stories, I started working on them in 2018. One of the earliest stories I had begun in 2015. So I kind of brought a lot of them to my MFA, which I started in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. And I really valued and loved my time at the Michener Center. And it's a smaller program. And just being in community for me with other writers was the number one reason why I applied for an MFA, was because I felt like I was sort of doing this work alone for about 6 years and feeling very isolated, very lost in the process, and really craving to be in conversation with other writers about their work and about my work. And I knew I couldn't afford an MFA traditionally, and so I sort of only applied to fully funded MFA programs, and very thankfully the Michener Center accepted me. So I had sort of those 3 years of not only revisiting these stories, but having the privilege of being able to look at them not as just disparate stories, but as, maybe one day this could be a book kind of thing. And within those 3 years, I had queried agents, and I found my agent, and we worked on the manuscript for about 6 more months together. Very, very close editorial partnership before she went out and sold the book. So a lot of that happened while I was in my MFA. And I think that being able to work on these stories with writers that I love so much, that I admire so much, has a lot to do with that. And I don't ever want to give writers the impression that that MFA programs don't have their benefits. It's a privilege to be able to pursue that. And there's a lot of sort of issues with finances and class and all of that, those that are wrapped up in that question of MFA. I think that what was important for me to remember was I needed to know that I was going into an MFA with very clear intentions. So my intentions for applying was to, again, be in conversation with other writers, and also to give myself the time to see if I could make these stories work, because I had been, working kind of really painful PR job for many years, and just feeling like I had to fight for every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes that I could get. And I was just kind of honestly tired of doing that, and I was tired of fighting, and I really wanted to give these stories the space that they needed. So I guess that was kind of a long-winded way of saying that, I think there are so many merits to an MFA. There's also a lot of opportunities now with Zoom and with sort of these incredible online classes with organizations like the Writers Center, where you can make community in a different way that's not a traditional MFA, and you can sort of pursue taking your work seriously by hearing from other writers and hearing from fellow writers. So I think that that's also just an incredibly beautiful thing that exists right now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I do think, if you get into a fully funded MFA program, you've
Yeah.
kind of got a no-brainer there, because
Yeah.
it's just a good opportunity, because it's often fully funded and stipended for the major ones. So it's, go write for a while. That's your life. And I mean, it's hard to match that experience. But I mean, we did the virtual Bread Loaf, but I've done several other just week-long workshops too. And that's a slightly more affordable way also to see if that environment is productive to you. It's a way to experiment a little bit.
Exactly.
An intensive environment for a week or 10 days, depending on which one you're looking at. So I don't know if that's like super concrete advice, but it's like that might be a way to see if that environment resonates with you, because I would never want someone to get invested in this thing and not like it, even if it was free. Like, that's a lot of your time, a lot of your life that you spend. If it doesn't work out, then
it's great advice. And I think it's important to just, I think what's helped me so much is just that I'm an overthinker, of course, but like that self-reflection of like, what do I want to get out of this? Like the workshop 3 days a week or whatever that looks like model might not be what you're looking for. It might not be what you need or what your work needs, and sort of just trying to, I love that, because then you get to, what you're saying is you get to do it in miniature or do it in these, very concentrated periods of time to figure out, what it is that works for you and what you need.
And there's some good low res programs now too, which is an interesting model where you basically work all year, but you have the intensive 10 days or 2 weeks. But back to the chat. A good question. I always hear it's harder to sell a collection of short stories than to sell a novel. And you've heard correctly in general. So what was your experience like, especially since this is your debut? And thanks and congratulations. I'll throw that in, because I think the congratulations are due.
Thank you. Thank you for the congratulations. Thank you for the question. And I have I might seem very like chipper and stuff. I have a lot of rage around the way that short stories are sort of I don't even want to say the way that they're received. I think it's more the way that publishing talks about them, and the way that they kind of create this narrative, a self-fulfilling narrative of people not reading short stories. And so, it's very frustrating for me, because, and I also feel like my heart is just in short stories. That's where I learned what kind of writer I wanted to be, and the stories that mattered to me was by reading short story writers and immersing myself in their work. So I was very committed to, it was always a dream of mine to publish a book. But I was very committed to wanting that book to be a story collection. That said, I will not lie and say that, it was really hard to get agents interested in a short story collection on its own. I have an incredible partnership with my agent. I'd say also in part because she is from Hawaii as well, and has a heart for championing and supporting writers of Pacific Islander writers in particular. And she was always incredibly supportive of stories, and that's just really, from what I've heard from my writer friends, it has been hard to find. For my experience debuting with this, this is the first book, but we actually had sold this as a part of a 2-book deal. So we went out with this collection in its entirety, and there was a novel partial attached. So I am working on a novel right now. And I don't want to speak for other writers, but the writers who I've been in conversation with who have had the same experience, it's been really sort of tough. And I think there's a lot going on that I even don't fully understand in sort of the book and publishing industry right now, around novels versus short stories. But I feel like because of the fact that stories are where I learned to be a writer, that's the genre that and the space that I want to always return to. So I would love to write another collection. But yeah, I guess all that to say, my experience is a very positive experience, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. But I do think that it demanded a bit of attention and effort on my part to insist that I wanted to make sure that the stories and the story collection was sort of where I put my attention and my effort in this moment.
And it reminds me, I know the author Brandon Taylor has spoken pretty just outright spoken about the fact that he's published a novel first, but basically in his deal with his agent and with the publisher, that he wanted to publish a collection too and have the collection treated with just as much respect as the novel, because he feels more like he might be a novelist or a story writer first and a novelist second. So I think maybe there's a little traction to get story collections, and and there's certainly been plenty of novels that were actually just linked story collections. We just literally tossed the word novel on there and call, and that was a story collection. It was 100% a story collection. I know I've done several like this was not a novel. It was a story collection, and you put
it's all marketing.
It's all marketing.
So
almost at the end here. We have one final question. Before that, though, I did want to touch on the story Mad Women, just because I love that story so much. It's like,
thank you.
I love all the stories, but that's one, like, if we read a story, like, this is the one I'm going to keep forever and teach and share with people and point to in the collection. So that one, like, really, that one messed with me. I'd like to ask one specific question about it, though. And it's a very interesting, like, very specific craft question. I don't feel like I get specific sometimes, but in the middle of that story, there's this one quick third-person scene that's almost in like a screenplay format. It's not quite a screenplay format, like, name, colon, dialogues at the beginning to set it up. So, and the rest of the story is not that. Really this one little breakaway. And it's so fascinating, and it works so well. And where did it come from? Why did this happen? And then part two of that is, did you get any pushback against that happening? Because I feel like a casual read and everybody like, no, we can't do that. That's just write it. I just want to know about that little section where we go from the more traditional narrative form to a very deliberate format, and then back immediately into the more conventional form.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That actually came out of feeling very stalled with that story, honestly. And that story in particular was a harder one for me to write, because I had put a lot of my own personal anxieties into that piece, around motherhood and raising a child. And I took a really long time writing that piece. And I think because of the time that I had spent with it, I had encountered a lot of walls while I was working on it. And that was an opportunity for me to sort of, I remember writing it actually on a different like Word document, and just being like, and in a different font. It was like a different Word document and a different font. And
Comic Sans.
I think they were, yeah, of course. Yeah, naturally.
Papyrus.
Yeah. Garamond, I'm not sure. But I remember I just needed to almost like trick myself into thinking you're working on something different, basically. And I don't think I was at the time. I wasn't reading a lot of screenplays. I ended up reading a lot of screenplays for my MFA, but I always really liked sort of that approach and writing the freedom that I felt with screenplays. So it's not like you said, it's not a very like traditional screenplay structure. It's more just like, it was an opportunity for me to kind of stay in the dialogue and to really stay in the conversation between the mother and the son, and just to kind of switch the register a little bit. I found that I was doing that. I still try to do that when I feel like I am stalled or stuck and I know I just want to keep on going, but in a different way. So like there's a story called Island Girls in the collection. And I had written, it starts with sort of a job ad. And I hadn't started that story with a job ad, but I had written it at a similar point in that piece where I felt very confused and not sure what the characters demanded and what that story demanded next. And it ended up being the piece that opened the story at the end. So I think I really enjoy kind of those moments of play, because it gets me out of my head so much. And yeah, in terms of your question about pushback, I actually didn't get pushback, and I was also surprised. No one ever said anything about it.
Maybe because it just
So
works so well. It works
that's
just absolutely
good.
so well. So maybe it was just too good for anyone to even possibly question it. But like
I'm glad to hear
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Just there's one question came directly to me in the chat, and I'm gonna throw it in because we're almost out of time. How is, now that you have the novel as book 2 of the book deal and you're working on that, how is working on a novel different from the short story process for you?
It is much harder for me personally. It is an incredibly daunting thing, and I can't really wrap my mind around why, because I feel like I grew up reading novels. I'm constantly devouring novels. I am having a very hard time with it, and I think that it is a matter of time too. I think it's an issue of that I need to spend more time with it, and that a lot of times for me, I tend to be a little bit of an impatient writer. So hence the messy first drafts. And there's a slowness that I'm finding, at least, that my novel demands, that I don't necessarily think I'm naturally comfortable with. So it's been a whole process of getting very uncomfortable with sort of undoing all of my writerly inclinations and really kind of responding to what this book needs, which is a very, very thoughtful slowness, a different process. And I'm working on it, and I'm very happy with sort of the characters that have populated this book, and I'm really excited about it. But I won't lie and say it's easy, because I think it's definitely, for me, it's been a very interesting and exciting and scary challenge. Yeah.
I went to Justin Torres was at Politics and Prose bookstore last night, and he took 12 years to write his second novel. So you got time.
Thank you. I'm going to keep that in mind.
And then a final question to wrap up the evening. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
I think that right now I am going to return to the note card that I have written on my desk right now, and that is advice from Kimberly King Parsons and Chelsea Beaker in their recent class, an online class as well. And they were talking about sort of revision and rejection, and sort of dealing with rejection and wading through all of that. And something that I wrote down from that class was to keep your head down and shut out the noise, because nothing beats a good writing day. And I really need to remind myself that all the time, because it is very easy, at least for me, it's been very easy to sort of get swept up in all the aspects of putting a book into the world, when my greatest pleasure is when I feel at peace with writing and at peace with where I'm at in my work. So reminding myself to sort of shut out that noise is important. And I think for writers just starting out too, it's very important, because I don't want to end on a downer, but I faced a great deal of rejection, as I'm sure all writers do, when trying to put work out into the world and see if anyone is interested in reading. And just kind of shutting that out and reminding myself of the absolute pleasure writing is, even when it's hard, even when it's, not coming as quickly or as easily as I'd like it to. That's where all the joy is for me as well. So I like to offer that to other writers as well.
Megan, this has been absolutely rad. Thank you so much for joining me, joining all of us this evening. Everyone, if you have not read it yet or don't have a copy, get a copy of Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare, the amazing best-selling story collection. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. A best-selling story collection. That's how good the story collection is. Not only was the story collection a bestseller, So please get a copy if you can. We put the link back in the window, or go back to your or go to your local independent bookseller if you have access to one of those. Megan, so good to see you again. Enjoy
good
the
to
rest
see
of
you.
your evening. It's early over there, I guess, so you still have plenty of time
Yes.
left in the
Yes.
day. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all
Thank
for coming
you.
out, and hope to see you in the audience again soon. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.